Welkom, u luistert naar Vrijheidradio.
Ja, dames en heren, het is weer een nieuwe aflevering van Vrijheidradio en het gaat een hele speciale aflevering worden, want we hebben niemand minder dan de enige echte Adam Kokesh in onze uitzending en daar zullen we het komende uur gewoon gezellig mee gaan praten. For all the English-speaking people, this introduction is in Dutch, and within a few seconds we're going to talk English, so you can understand what we are saying. Maar first of all, even nu weer over naar het Nederlands. Ik ga je nog iemand anders aan u voorstellen. Dat is
Stefan.
Uit Rotterdam. Met een kuchje.
Ja, met een kuchje inderdaad. Nee, ik ben inderdaad Stefan Strak. Ik kom uit Rotterdam. Ik hou van mijn vrijheid. Ben zelf libertariër. Ik studeer. Ik ben judoka. Geef daarnaast ook les als judoleraar. Daar komt ook mijn filosofie over eigenlijk lesgeven, hoe we met elkaar moeten omgaan op een vreedzame manier eigenlijk. En dat is een beetje mijn achtergrond ook, hoe ik in dit wereldje terecht ben gekomen.
Ja, nou leuk joh, ja, gezellig. Je zal wel vaker komen denk ik ook hè?
Dat denk ik wel inderdaad.
Ja. Nou, we hebben nu verder geen goud, zilver, bitcoin nieuws. Het komt er gewoon omdat Adam Kokesh zo meteen aan het woord is en dan zal hij het hele uur vullen. En dus we gaan nu over naar Adam Kokesh. We have Adam Kokesh. Give him a big applause. Hi.
Welcome. Thanks for having me on.
You have written a book, Freedom. We talked about it before in our show, and it's a great book. But first, there are libertarians also in the Netherlands who have never heard about you. And so, tell us who you are, what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak to a foreign audience. And it's exciting to see that the movement is a global one every time we hear from fans and fellow activists around the world. And I'm just so lucky to be in a position to do this and to connect with people because I've been an activist for, taking it back, I guess 7 years now. It's crazy. You could go back further. I mean, I was a libertarian in high school because I didn't want to be a Republican or Democrat because, of course, that's lame. What are my options? Okay, leave me alone. All right, I'll be a libertarian. But one of the things I'm really passionate about now is making sure that people understand what that word means because I actually called myself a libertarian, means believing in freedom, and I didn't really understand it. So I actually enlisted in the Marine Corps and then volunteered to go to Fallujah, Iraq in 2004. And for me, it was a 10-year process of going from, I'm going to be a libertarian because I don't want to be a Republican or Democrat, to really understanding it at a philosophical level. And going to Iraq was a really important part of that because when I came home, I wanted to get involved with the anti-war movement. And I found a group called Iraq Veterans Against the War and was very active with them. I was in grad school in Washington, D.C. at the time. And I was surrounded by lefties, in the anti-war movement. And it was good people, like a lot of really dedicated activists, people who are willing to get arrested and, make a lot of sacrifices, really, to make it harder for the war makers to do what they do. But I was surrounded mostly by other veterans that I was working with. And we had some amazing conversations. We were touring the country, speaking out, and encouraging GI resistance, that is resistance from within the military, encouraging people to get out, to refuse what were essentially unlawful deployment orders to Iraq. Mm-hmm. So as a libertarian, I knew I was right about everything. Mm-hmm. I just had to prove it, So I actually had a lot of these great conversations with guys that would end in disagreements over opinion, like, this will be better or that'll be better. And I knew that there had to be better answers, that there had to be airtight answers to all the questions of politics and society that were relevant to those conversations. So I started doing my research, and I went further and further down the rabbit hole, and I came to understand freedom on a philosophical level, largely from reading Rothbard, watching documentaries, studying economics, and you come to understand eventually, and to me this is really the crux of it, that freedom is not just something you get for yourself. It is a moral philosophy about how you relate to other people. And then you understand, like a law of science, like the law of gravity. There's a principle called the non-aggression principle, based on the idea that you as a free human being own yourself. I know, crazy idea when the state is trying to own everyone and everything. And it is a dangerous to the establishment kind of revolutionary idea. But it's really a very simple, irrefutable, practically scientific principle that human relations are always happier when they're free of force and fraud and coercion. Yeah. And that can be applied universally to the state. And you guys know this. I mean, you see, this is global, and you got this from the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I got started as an anti-war activist, and then I ended up running for Congress as a Republican in New Mexico. Yeah, I know. I say now, like, hey, I was in the Marines, but I'm better now. I don't even tell people that I was a Republican. So I was a Republican, but I'm better now. And that really was the completion of my process philosophically. It happened while I was running for office. And then when it was over, I couldn't shut up when the campaign was done. So I got a radio show, and that was the start of Adam versus the Man. And then it got picked up as a TV show right before it was going to get canceled. And I had a TV show in D.C. on the Russian network, RT America, for 4 months before I was canceled for political reasons. Then decided to go independent. And I've been doing a podcast and a YouTube channel and making a living doing that since then. But as you know, I've always considered myself an activist first, and the objective is to advance humanity, to move the world forward. And now it's really about establishing a voluntary society. And, you know, probably some of my, exploits as a anti-war organizer, doing a mock combat patrol in D.C., doing the Winter Soldier testimony hearings, where we had hundreds of veterans come together and share their stories to really paint a picture of what it was like on the ground. We organized a march of thousands of veterans on the White House for Ron Paul, for Veterans for Ron Paul in 2011. I've done civil disobedience in a variety of forms in anti-war protests, but possibly most well-known. And I'll bet some of your listeners have seen the Jefferson Dance Party video. You guys know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, we had Eddie Free also on the show.
Yeah, awesome. Eddie Free was the one who really came up with that event. So we got arrested for dancing at the Jefferson Memorial and had a video that went globally viral. And I'm always shocked to hear how many people started questioning the state when they saw that, when they saw what it means to enforce a law against dancing in a public place, which is pretty insane. I got picked up and body slammed and choked by a police officer for dancing. And since then, I've done a lot of marijuana civil disobedience and made a YouTube video last year on Independence Day loading a shotgun 2 blocks from the White House in D.C. And I think it was the first time a YouTube video has resulted in a SWAT team raid with more men than they sent after bin Laden, which is actually the second time they did that for me. The other time was smoking pot in front of the White House. And now that I'm, and this is kind of jumping ahead, but as long as we're on my story, I recently wrote a book. Well, I was in jail for 4 months last year as a result of that YouTube video. And while I was in jail, I started writing this book called Freedom. And I wrote it because no such tool existed for our movement as an outreach tool, as a way to capture the entire message in a way that was not Amerocentric, but rather about the global phenomenon of statism, and was presenting solutions as well as incorporating the effect of technology on society, which is something I think a lot of people in politics overlook, or at least don't adequately consider, especially as it relates to how humanity is moving forwards towards a free society. So I didn't realize how much the book would change me, but we released it on Independence Day of this year. And I say we because I really had a lot of help when I got out of jail, making this book everything it could be and having people poke holes in it and then fill in those holes. And it was a really incredible experience to have so many people help out with a project like this. But now I've just decided to make it completely front and center in my life. We killed the brand Adam versus the Man, and it's all about the Freedom Line now, thefreedomline.com. My podcast is The Freedom Line. And I'm going on tour for the next year. I'm going to be living out of an RV trailer in order to travel the country and promote the book.
Yeah, this is the Campfire Tour, huh?
Yeah, the American Campfire Freedom Tour. Well, does this seem like, a silly kind of American thing to you over there to be, I don't know, is there a campfire tradition?
I did when I was very young, and I like it. At night we go to a park. and then we have a campfire, and it's illegal. And so we did it always at night, and then took a lot of beer and alcohol, and yeah, and have fun for the whole night. Yeah.
Well, I think there is something distinctly American, and maybe I'm being ethnocentric or nationalistic here, but I think there's a certain American camping tradition, and it's certainly a global thing, the human phenomenon of wanting to gather around a fire and have communion and drink wine and talk and play music, and we play guitar, things like that. Yeah. So we're kind of incorporating that not just as a theme for the tour, as for how we want to connect with people, but we're actually going to be doing a lot of events like that where it's just we're going to be setting up a campfire next to the RV and inviting people to come and hang out and talk about the message and talk about the movement. But right now, and you certainly know this where you are, we are way behind as a movement. We are extremely small. In the United States, where there are more libertarians than anywhere else, we're still less than 1% of the population. Yeah. And it's we see a lot of wasted energy in the movement. We see a lot of people who invest in inefficient activism. And if you understand the message, and if you really want to achieve a free society, then we have to be ruthless in analyzing the efficiency of our activism in terms of what is working and what is actually waking people up and growing the movement. So that's why I'm focused on the book and getting it into new hands.
I liked also what you said in some of your videos about happiness. That happiness is important to gain liberty and life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that if I look around, that some libertarians, they get stuck in this more negative feeling, like look how bad the state is, and look what the cops are doing, and
yeah,
I think it's better for the PR or whatever you call it to be more happy and optimistic.
Well, it's even more fundamental than that, and you're absolutely right. And I've been talking about this in terms of the PR, where a lot of people wake up to the nature of government and it makes them sad and angry and depressed and frustrated. And then they go out into the world and say, now join me in my fear and my anger and my depression. Yeah. And everybody says, screw that. I'm going to go back to the warm, welcoming arms of government where I don't have to think, or I can just, have that kind of ignorant bliss. But the reason we choose to embrace the message is because it makes us happier as individuals, even if in the short term we get stuck in this negative feedback loop. One of the things about the book that is so important is that it pulls people through that. And this is important not just for PR, but for ourselves as individuals, as a movement, to think that if we are choosing to do something as a rational choice, we must be doing it because in some way it makes our lives better. And if we want to share that with people, we should be sharing that positivity. So this was a really important epiphany that came to me while I was in jail in solitary confinement. And I found myself really happy. And I was like, I'd wake up every day with a smile on my face, knowing that I was there for a righteous cause. And there were a lot of immediate challenges. And I compare this to my time in Fallujah, where I was the guy on the team that would always wake up telling jokes and singing songs and trying to cheer everybody up. And it's a really simple point that I think when you get philosophical, when you start thinking about libertarianism, you often overlook, which is that if you're truly free inside your own head, you can choose your demeanor at any time. You can exercise that kind of self-discipline. Yeah. And it's not even self-discipline, but just self-control and exercising that freedom and having that respect for your own will as a human being to not be emotionally bullied by people around you, whether it's individuals in your life. And for most people, that's a bigger factor than government. But government does the exact same thing. And this is true the world, worldwide, that governments keep us afraid. They want us to be beaten down. And this, is also covered in the book when we're talking about nationalism and patriotism, because a truly self-confident, actualized human being does not need tribalism, does not need group identity, does not need group think, does not need to be a part of the herd. So they like to keep people afraid and beaten down and psychologically deficient. This is all built in now to the government education systems of the world. Yeah. And they have an interest in fostering the mentality of collectivism because it feeds into statism and the whole racket.
Yeah, I was reading your book and I found it really interesting. And one of the questions I had, your experience in Iraq did it influence the structure of your book? Because you start with your philosophy, the history of power, and then in the third chapter you immediately mention war.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I don't know if it was so much my experience in Iraq as just my understanding of things. And my understanding of the philosophy is motivated by my personal experience, as it is with anyone. And one of the ways the book is written that's cool about that is that it doesn't give any kind of national specifics. It allows people to fill in the facts from their own experience, and it always rings true. So the structure of the book, leading with war as a first, topic-specific chapter, other than, as you mentioned, there's the introduction, which lays out the philosophy and the context, and then chapter 2 is a brief history of power, which is sort of how we got to this point in time. And then the first major thing is war, and it's because war is the greatest crime against freedom. War, if you understand freedom or a state of a free society being one of nonviolence, respect for self-ownership and individual rights, then you understand that if you wanted to measure violations of freedom, it would be by violence, by how much death and destruction and pain you're causing. And there's no greater phenomenon of that the state engages in than war. And it is so absurd when you're able to step back and take that historical perspective and look at it. So, my combat experience was very important to me waking up and, motivating me to question my reality and question my experience. And it was the gateway for me. But you don't have to go to Iraq to know that the war was a bad idea. If anything, I'm a slow learner. I like to. Why do things the easy way when you can do them the Marine Corps way? And
yeah.
I learned a lot in that sense from my experience, but it's such and in that sense, it is kind of personal. And there is a section in that chapter called Soldiering that is a little bit more personal, because it was about, and that chapter is really written, for a very specific purpose, or two purposes. One, so that people who are considering joining the military never join. And it explains how being a soldier, killing for politicians, essentially makes you a sucker. And that was a tough pill for me to swallow. That took me a long time to really internalize and accept that. So the second purpose of it is for guys who are going through a process similar to mine, guys who are combat vets or veterans of some kind, who come home and are in denial about that. And facing up to that reality is so important. And I dealt with PTSD, so accepting that, when you can square your experience with reality instead of burying the inconsistencies and the cognitive dissonance, is really empowering for veterans in general.
And what is your influence? You were in the Marine Corps, you did know how to defend yourself. Did it in any way also influence your perception, how people who interact in an aggressive way can... What's your philosophy behind it? Because I'm a black belt judoka, and for me, judo, or the budo way of seeing things and interacting with one another and being mutual respectful and knowing what harm can be done to one another, was for me an eye-opener how destructive governments can be if you have control over someone in case of using power over one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very related. I like to see it on a continuum of violence. And this is really important as well to understanding the state and understanding people's psychological attachment to it, is understanding it as violence and trying to understand what motivates people to violence. What actually causes violence? What is on an individual psychological level? Because even when it's a war that is being done by society as a whole, of course, it's being carried out by individuals. It's a sum of individual decisions. And when my background is in psychology. When I say background, I mean I majored in psychology in undergrad. So I think I've got some good perspective on that, and I learned a lot from that experience, especially about how people think in groups. But in terms of like the root causes of violence, it really is. It comes out of insecurity. It comes out of an inability to get what you want and to be happy by interacting with people peacefully. So in that sense, violence is always a failure of love and connectedness. It is always a failure of the market to be the dominant means of relating to people. When people understand that relating to people as fellow market actors, whether it's with money or in a romantic relationship or in a family relationship or in a friendship is really, really important, and building ourselves up. So like this is to take it back to happiness. I think if everybody in the world got the happiness idea, then they'd be much less inclined to violence. And so that's a really important theme for me in my message now, and obviously in the book. And I hope to be able to bring that to my activism as well. But, to get back to what you said, Johan, about selling it from a PR perspective, it's also a much better selling point. And I really think it's important to see the libertarian movement not as a political movement, but an anti-political movement.
Yeah.
If politics is the art of pointing guns at each other to organize society, then our message is, no, that is not a legitimate way to organize society. Stop making excuses for violence. Stop endorsing the violence of the state. Stop pretending that the state is not a violent monopoly, that it's not a coercive organization. And when people are able to do that, they're able to live better as a result. You're able to avoid the state. You're able to be happier. You're able to live freer. And that's what I'm selling now, and if you see this as a political movement, you're selling it as I'm right, you're wrong. Yeah. And then all you end up doing is arguing. But if what you're selling is the truth, and it's the truth, and it's made your life better, then what you're going to the world with is, hey, check this out. These ideas have made my life better. They could make your life better too.
Yeah.
So for you, the key is to cooperate between people and to be self-organizing, finding other ways around the state to solve current issues that are not handled in a proper way by the state.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of agorism. There's a section in the book on agorism, and Sam Ed Konkin III. Are you familiar with his work?
No, I'm not familiar.
I do.
Konkin is a very important intellectual in the history of the libertarian movement, because he really codified the idea of agorism, which is conducting your economic relationships away from the state. And it's tax avoidance, it's regulation avoidance, it's the Bitcoin market, it's Silk Road, it's all of those things that disempower the state. And when people see it for what it is, most people don't need to be told, like, hey, if you can do something in cash instead of with a credit card or getting paid with a check, and then you don't have to pay taxes on it, that's better than having the government steal your money. But when they don't see it as stealing their money, there's a kind of guilt that goes along with it. There's a kind of shame when you don't have the moral backing for what you're doing, and you've succumbed, you've given in to the bullying of the state that says, if you don't pay your taxes, you're wrong. If you don't let us steal from you, you're wrong. You're a bad person. You're a drag on society. Then, you end up with a lot of cognitive dissonance. And I think giving people the message who are already inclined to that cures that for them and gives them an extra confidence in doing it, and empowers them to do it proudly. And obviously there's some things that, maybe you don't want to talk about publicly for liability reasons, but that you want to be able to get out and share with people as part of this effort to say, look, the movement, the message, it makes my life better, and I live more free as a result. So agorism is huge in disempowering the state. But I always want to go a step further with everything, and I'm naturally a contrarian who wants to challenge the status quo. One of the things that is in the book in chapter 6 on economics, which is another subject that I think libertarians are sort of familiar with but tend to shy away from, which is that everything is economics. Every voluntary relationship is an economic relationship, and I would say even a marriage or a friendship or any kind of family or romantic relationship can be seen as an economic exchange and a great exchange of value. And when we say, no, that's something else, and you can say, well, maybe it's not quantifiable. Maybe you can't put numbers on that. But if you see it as a voluntary exchange of value, you're able to really assess your relationships in a much more empowering way. And this is huge, too, because a lot of us get bullied into relationships that are not in our best interest in our personal lives, in codependent, romantic relationships, or in abusive family relationships. And when you're able to step back and go like, okay, well, this is an exchange. What is the basis of this exchange? What is the basis of my relationship with this person? Is it good for me or bad for me? Should I end it? Should I just break this off? Or at least to be more clear. And this is so huge too, just to be able to communicate, to be able to see all of your relationships as things that you aren't tied to, but as voluntary relationships that you choose to engage in. you can express your preferences a lot more openly and clearly.
Well, that was one of the things I liked about your chapter economics, because one of the things I always miss is more the Austrian perspective of human action and interaction to invest your time, energy, ideas to one another and become to create a synergy between the two to create something new or better than there was before by interacting with other members of a group.
Absolutely.
And I think you summed up it perfectly for people that don't really have a background into economics to make it more approachable, that everything in our world is subjective, and we assign to everything a value, a subjective value.
Right. And a lot of the racket of the state is to obscure that value, or to make it harder to determine whether or not you're getting a good deal out of it, or to keep you, afraid so that you don't even analyze it in those terms. But anybody who looks at it goes, gee, are we getting a good deal out of government? Hell no. No worries. I want to say I really appreciate you guys, making the effort to come across the language barrier and connect with people in the United States and plug into the broader movement. And I hope that Johan, you mentioned you were going to be translating freedom.
Yeah, that's also what I want to talk about. I have this plan to translate it from English into Dutch. And I'm also looking for volunteers, people who want to help with translating the book in Dutch. I have already one person.
Awesome.
Yeah, so if people are listening now and they say, hey, I want to do a chapter 2, well, yeah, just mail me. In how many languages is it already translated?
Oh, we don't have any yet. It's been very slow as a process, and if it's exciting to see that we have people working on it in so many places. But this is an all-volunteer effort. So we have, I'd like to get it into languages to cover 90% of the world, and there are a lot of Asian languages where we don't have anybody working on it, which is kind of a scary thought to think that there's a whole mass of people that I don't want to say are cut off from the message, because that would be presumptuous, but that are not as plugged into the rest of the movement, if nothing else. And we've got people working on, I don't know, we have on our forums at forums.adamversustheman.com, we have people working on translations, and let's see, I'm pulling it up right now. I think we've got like 30 or 40 volunteers, and let me see, I'm going through this. All right, translations. We've got people working on Arabic, Bulgarian, Dutch, Esperanto, Farsi, Finnish, French, German, Italian, Hebrew, Klingon. I think it's important.
I don't know where Klingon is. But
yeah. We need to bring the message to an intergalactic audience. We have someone doing a Latin translation, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Serbian, Spanish, of course, and Swedish and Thai. But there's a lot of languages in here that Cantonese, especially Hindi, Japanese. If we could get people who want to translate into those, Mandarin, some of those big Asian languages, we can really take this to a much more broad audience.
Yeah.
You mentioned technology as the driver for a new society.
Yeah,
absolutely.
One of the problems I'm seeing, and probably more people are seeing right now, is the control governments want over technology to influence and manipulate it. How do you see us as a society going before or against the government to give technology a better chance? Because when I see it right now, technology will be more and more constrained to protect the state.
Yeah, well, it's a most important battleground in the short term in terms of keeping technology free, keeping government from restraining it. A lot of what the government is doing with the internet and polluting the conversation is pretty scary. I think most people don't have a sense of this, but the NSA is a huge, huge government agency. In the United States, there are 1.3 million Americans that are part of the national security apparatus in terms of, the intelligence community that have secret clearances. And we know that the Defense Department has a contract out, and we assume now that it's filled, for a sock puppet program that allows them to control multiple online personalities with complete backgrounds in order to swarm comment sections. And one of the cool things about the internet is that you can look at people, you can look at the audience reaction to anything right away, whether it's a YouTube video or a blog post or a meme picture. You can see all the comments and go, oh, okay, well, this is what other people are reacting. It gives me confidence in my reaction. And they are really polluting the conversation. And I think we have to be very careful about how we use the internet already, just to understand the influence that the government has over it, and make sure that we're not being swayed by, propagandists or bots or comment spammers who are working for the government. All that said, I'm very excited about this, and I'm not worried about the long term, because technology is fundamentally empowering, and the more advanced it gets, the faster it gets distributed. So if you go back to the invention of the automobile, it took 100 years to go from, well, if you were rich you could drive a car, to today where rich man drives a Porsche and a poor man gets to drive a beat up Honda Civic, but everybody gets to drive. By comparison, you look at cell phone technology, and from the beginning of Bill Clinton's presidency in 1992, there were the kind of communication technology he had was incredible, but no one else on earth had it. 8 years later, a bushman in sub-Saharan Africa with a smartphone had more communications capability than President Clinton did 8 years earlier. And that kind of rapid distribution, you look at 3D printing and everything that's happening with the internet right now, it is going faster and faster. And a lot of people are afraid of surveillance, for example. I think the surveillance technology and cameras that we have are incredibly empowering, and they're a positive thing. They're a force for good and accountability as long as they're used right. The question is, who are we accountable to? And as long as we allow ourselves to think that government is holding us accountable and government surveillance is how that technology is being employed, then it's a dangerous threat. But the technology itself is also empowering us to record cops, to record TSA agents, to record politicians and government officials. And I think that has a much more positive long-term effect than the negative short-term effect of, well, government is actually going to, enforce its illegal, immoral, illegitimate laws more efficiently with surveillance. You look at the empowerment of the internet in general in terms of making people healthier mentally, being able to, give people the therapeutic effect in so many ways. And I'm not just talking about porn, guys. All the ways that people are connecting on the internet with people who they never would be able to otherwise, and realizing that they're not alone in whatever they're going through. That's so important, so empowering. And we know, and you guys know, like the Defense Department, DARPA, that they're always, 10, 20 years ahead of civilian technology. And so who knows what they have and what they're keeping from us, and that's kind of scary too. But because technology is empowering people so much on an individual level, the ability of the state to get away with whatever it's trying to get away with is already greatly diminished. And I only see that continuing. I don't see anything that would buck that trend. And if anything, it's accelerating. With Moore's law and the exponential growth of computing power, all of this stuff is going to be happening just that much faster. And again, because everything's covered in the book, right? This is in chapter 10, The Future of Freedom, talking about the asymptote of the human experience, of how all of these exponential growth curves are converging, and humanity is about to enter a new phase. So I think this is the more people, this is my motivation for spreading the message, because I'm not one of these doom and gloom guys. Mm-hmm. And when someone tries to tell you, in the United States, I'm 32, and I came into this movement, really just a few years ago. But since the message was codified, since people started talking about it as libertarianism, when Rothbard really came up with it as a coherent philosophy, to Ron Paul talking about the Federal Reserve, to everybody else who's been doing this, we've been hearing, hey, the dollar's about to collapse, you better buy gold and silver, and by the way, buy it from our sponsors. I'm sponsored by a gold and silver company, and they're amazing. They take Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. This is amagimetals.com, of course, and I think it's still essential. But we've been told the dollar's about to collapse, for 40 years. Yeah. And it's like, come on, guys, that's not where things are going, and we might be headed down a bad path with government today, growing as it is exponentially, with the monetary system growing in its power, but it's also losing power, especially now with cryptocurrencies, with Bitcoin. And all the ways that the state is being disempowered are the much more dominant long-term trends than the relatively short-term trends of how government is growing and becoming more invasive. So a lot of people fall for this sort of fear-mongering version of libertarianism, where it's like, if we don't get out the pitchforks now, if we don't overthrow this government thing soon, we're all going to die in nuclear war or from Ebola or whatever the case may be, whatever the latest fear-mongering is. And if you're giving into that fear, then you're falling for the racket that they want you to believe. If you're afraid, that's fine. If you meet them with anger and fear, they can still control you. But if you meet them with love and happiness, they have no idea what to do. They can't handle that, because that's the only way they are truly, truly disempowered. And if you look at the long-term trends, it's clear that we are advancing towards a voluntary society. It's a matter of how peacefully can we manage this transition? Can we do it in an orderly way that doesn't pull the rug out from underneath anyone, and that really keeps in mind that our objective is universal nonviolence?
You wrote also in the book about the patterns, eh?
Yeah.
You wrote something about the intellectual property.
Another very undercovered issue in the libertarian movement. And because I was a slow learner, like I said, it took me 10 years to really understand libertarianism. It took me a long time to wrap my head around the issue of intellectual property, but I'm really glad that I did it before I became a content producer, because it's very much influenced me in how I've done my podcast and my YouTube channel, making sure that everything I do is open source and copy left. People can do whatever they want with it as long as they're not charging for it. And this gets back to some very fundamental concepts. And I approach this from a very careful perspective, because for me, it's like, well, I had to, I learned this the hard way, and I learned very slow. But most, especially younger people, don't seem to have a problem with this. People who really grew up with the internet, and they understand that the internet is destroying this concept of intellectual property. That, when you have everybody connected and everything that could be considered intellectual property can be reduced to data and instantly shared around the world. The question becomes, how do you stop that? How do you actually enforce this disgusting concept, this racket of intellectual property? And you have to use violence. You have to use force to violate individual property rights. And when you realize that that's what it is, and you have confidence in the message of freedom, then you can kind of square that with the rest of the issues around intellectual property, around copyright and patents. And a lot of people, just to take it back to the big libertarian cliche, talking to a statist, a child, when they're confronted with something that they don't want to admit to or acknowledge, they put their fingers in their ears and go, nah, 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 you can't hear me, or I can't hear you, right? And everybody knows 2-year-olds who do this. But for adults, they do the same thing. It just sounds like this. Mm-hmm. But who will build the roads? I don't want to think about this reality. I don't want to acknowledge that nonviolence is better than violence. I don't want to acknowledge that I'm dependent and supportive of this violent institution called government. I'm just going to throw out this ridiculous question that is totally groundless and just say, oh, but if you can't answer exactly who will build the roads, and it's not a hard question. People will build the roads. People acting peacefully.
Do I want roads?
Yeah, as opposed to people funded by violence. Yeah, really, if you think about what we're going to be capable of with technology these days in a free society without the interference of government, we're not going to need roads where we're going, baby. It's all going to be drone taxis and flying cars, and you're right. A lot of people, though, they have the same objection when you say no intellectual property. But what is the incentive for invention? Like the guy that invented the wheel. Well, I've got this great idea for a wheel that's going to allow us to do all these really cool things, but I'm going to wait until we invent government first so that I can profit from my idea. That's just not how it works. It's not realistic. And if anything, we've become so dependent on this status quo of this concept of intellectual property that it is hard to see past it. But I don't know. I think younger people, especially with a lot of creativity, with an open mind, people who aren't locked into this system, who haven't been propagandized their entire lives, people who engage in open source collaboration on the internet, people who rip music, people who have an expectation of free content. It's actually easier to envision a world without the racket of intellectual property than to look at the world around us today and see how this concept of intellectual property has destroyed innovation, has hindered it, has allowed it to favor corporations and sequestering of technology, how it's destroyed the music industry and the movie industry and led to an incredible concentration of wealth and power that never should have existed in the first place.
But do you think that in an agorist society, that people will just invent things, build things that never existed before, that we will just fly around in some science fiction thing?
Look at what we have already.
Yeah.
Look at right now we have an Indiegogo campaign for the American Campfire Freedom Tour, and people can donate to support our printing of more books to give away for free while I'm on the road. And we're really grateful for everybody who's contributing to that. But I mentioned that as just to point out that crowdfunding and investing in advance is providing a whole other means of funding research and development. And most of the projects that people get excited about on Indiegogo or on Kickstarter are like the Solar Roads project, roads made out of solar panels. And things like that are happening because people want to see that technology, and now we can vote with our dollars, we can pool our resources, we don't have to be alone in doing it. And if anything, we see a much more robust environment for innovation. We see innovation serving the people rather than serving corporate needs, rather than serving the system that is set up with violence. And that's a really exciting development that, it's like we don't have to wait for people to throw off the racket of intellectual property to already see the benefits that technology brings when you don't have to use intellectual property. And as you know, for the book, like for me, I'm applying this in my own life. I have never claimed any kind of intellectual property rights over any of the content that I have produced. And as a result, I've been able to compete in a new environment, in a new economy, and been able to make a living doing what I'm doing. And it's a really cool position to be in, where because of the internet, someone in my business is able to do this already. But as you know, the book, it's free, it's open source, online, in every digital format possible. And it says right there in the book, do whatever you want with this. You want to rip it, rewrite it, put your name on the cover. And if you take a book that I wrote and you can put your name on the cover and you can get more people to read it than I can, good for you. I hope you can make that happen.
Yeah. Yeah. But what if, for instance, somebody in the agorist community invents some super spaceship machine that never existed before, and then somebody from the States say, "Hey, you don't have a pattern on it." Well, then I put just like Thomas Edison did with Tesla. I put my name on it. And then I sue you because you are flying this machine.
But that's all the more reason to overthrow the system as soon as we can and enjoy the benefits of all this technology.
To hook in on intellectual property, how do you think about governments and not having there's no intellectual tolerance anymore for people who think differently about certain aspects like medicines, where only pharmaceutical medicines are good and things derived from plants are bad?
You think that's really true? I think the opposite is true. I think with the internet, more and more people, when they have an issue, they're going to Google it, they're going to look around, they're going to ask their friends for what works. And I think one of the coolest things about the internet really is opening up the monopoly on medical information. I mean, look at everybody who's finding out about medical marijuana applications through the internet that they're not getting from their doctors, that they're not getting from television, they're getting from the internet. I would say you might see in the mainstream a sort of pushback in the mainstream media, an effort to marginalize or make fun of people who are doing I just want to say like I think the only proper term is non-establishment medicine. I want to say unconventional, but it's becoming conventional. Like right now, what do people, when people used to have to go to the doctor because they had no idea what was going on with them and something was wrong, now they go to webmd.com or they just look it up online and they see every single remedy out there. And, modern industrial medicine has its place and it's now forced to compete with everything else because you can go online and say, well, here are my treatment options now. I could go to a doctor and I could get a prescription or an operation. or I could do this with an holistic practitioner, or I could do this on my own, or I could do this with herbal supplements, or I could do this with my own diet, and so many diseases are related to diet and exercise deficiencies that people are able to cure their diseases with food now, because they realize in the past, like, well, it used to be, and forgive me for reflecting the Amerocentric perspective here, but in the United States it was, well, the FDA has issued the food pyramid, and you're supposed to have this many servings of grains and this many servings of meat and this of dairy and blah blah blah, and people would eat that diet and then they would have problems. And they would think, well, I'm eating perfectly healthy. It must be something else that I have to go to a doctor for. And they go to a doctor, and then they get some prescriptions, and they get pills for whatever it is that ails them. Whereas now people are able to look this up online, and they go, oh, gee, maybe this problem is because I'm not eating enough of this, or I'm not eating enough of that. And then they're able to, and the paleo diet, is a big thing that's being driven in the libertarian community by a lot of us, because I believe in it. And that, there are a lot of different versions of the paleo diet, but the idea of eating simply, eating clean, eating healthy, and supplementing with vitamins in a way that's good for whatever ails you is so much more effective at curing most diseases than going to modern medicine. So I don't know, maybe in the Netherlands, maybe it's different, but in the United States, and I would assume to a certain extent globally, the internet has really had a powerful effect at challenging the intellectual monopoly of the medical establishment.
Yeah. And also the same with the Wikipedia. I mean, I learned more from Wikipedia than from school.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you think about kids these days going to school with smartphones in their pockets.
Yeah.
Holy crap. I mean, how does that change the experience? How much harder is it to lie to someone who has the truth button in their pocket?
Yeah.
Do you also see a bigger division between people who are self-empowering, searching up their own information, and let's say the old state institutions who hang on to the old information and have a cognitive dissonance against people who think differently, because education and medicine are controlled by the government, and there you don't see a lot of change, or maybe in a slower pace than maybe is wanted by the community.
I think at first, and here I'm really just sort of speculating. I've never considered the issue from this perspective in a timeline sense, like I'm about to, which is that I think with the advent of the internet, like a couple of decades ago, starting to become relevant, there was that pushback. There was an institutional reaction of resistance, like, oh crap, this is a threat. We have to shore up against this. We have to resist this. We have to become more rigid in some ways. But I would say now that the internet has forced a new flexibility in the system, that it knows if it wants to survive, it has to adapt. So when you say like the medical establishment as an example, it used to be that that there might have been doctors being taught, hey, you just tell your patient whatever's going on and they're going to accept it, and you move on to the next patient. And we've seen this as a problem, especially in the United States, with all the overhead imposed costs on the medical industry, where doctors have to go, they get 5 minutes with a patient and they end up writing a lot of prescriptions. Whereas now I think there's a higher expectation of a patient wanting to have a certain amount of engagement in their own treatment. If it used to be, if you could hand someone a prescription and say, follow our instructions, and you take it 3 times a day, and that's how it goes. And now I think there's a higher standard, and maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I really think this is at every level, even among the people who we might derisively call sheeple, that because that information is out there, they want a higher level of engagement. They want to go, oh, well, what is the history of this this drug? Can I read some reviews online? Can I see how other people have related to it or reacted to it? And so if you give someone a prescription for a serious disease and they decide that they're going to take it, if they can't call you as a doctor, at least they're going to be going online and talking to other people who have experience with it. And there's so many great communities, as I mentioned earlier, online, of people connecting in ways they couldn't before. Like if you have a rare disease, well, before you go to a doctor, whatever the doctor says, that's all you know about it. Now you can go online and there are communities where they're seeing best practices that fly in the face of the medical establishment, and the establishment is having to adapt. I think that's a phenomenon that has a lot of implications in a lot of different areas, not just the medical industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also one of the patterns I saw. What you saw in the medieval ages with the printing press, where the West embraced the printing press and the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire didn't embrace it at the same level as the West. And eventually the West thrived where the Ottoman Empire imploded because of the restriction of knowledge by the clergy.
And now that's in hyperactive mode with the internet.
Yeah. You can say that the internet is the printing press of today. And you have also the 3D printing. I think that will also create a revolution, don't you think?
Absolutely. No, and I haven't been talking about this much recently because we haven't seen a whole lot of news in 3D printing. And I think it's one of these technologies that's just waiting to be fully actualized when it becomes more mainstream. And I don't mean mainstream like because people don't know about it or they don't want it, but the technology isn't convenient enough yet. Mm-hmm. You know, when you can get a 3D printer that works like a television, where you can just point at it with a remote control or speak at it, and this isn't so much a matter of the physical technology, this is really just a matter of programming. It's just a matter of time before someone puts this together. And I've talked to a number of entrepreneurs who are fans of Adam versus the Man who got turned on to 3D printing from me talking about it a couple of years ago when it was first, getting some kind of at least mainstream acknowledgement. And there are a bunch of different groups that are now working on what is like the dishwasher equivalent of a 3D printer, that it's just a giant box that you install with a house and it comes with the house, or you put it in like a major appliance, and you have a much more advanced computer that controls it. You can tell it whatever you want and it just prints it out. But what we're coming to, and to me this is the crux, is that when it comes to, like right now, if I said, hey, we're going to have plastic and metal for 3D printing on tap, on demand, like water and electricity, you might say, okay, well, that's crazy. That's far-fetched. You got to really think about, how the infrastructure develops for that. But if I said, yeah, but what about data? Right now, with the internet, we have unlimited data on tap. How did that happen? Well, when the technology is there, people will find a way and the infrastructure will come. And when 3D printing gets to that point, then you're going to see that's going to be the 3D printer revolution. When people have it as a device in their homes that can make anything they want, and we have all the supplies on tap. But I got a big caveat to this, is that we also have molecular 3D printing in the works. That is, it's already happening, at least in laboratories. They're putting this together. So we might leapfrog that phase entirely and just go to molecular 3D printing, where you're literally rearranging particles out of the air into an object. And I'm like, I fantasize about this, and this is so essential to where we're going with government as well. And again, I think a lot of libertarians don't give this adequate consideration. But there's one thing from Zeitgeist, the movies, the documentary, and I obviously disagree with a lot of where Peter Joseph went with that. But one of the things that he talked about that's a really important idea is the concept of a post-scarcity society. Now, I don't really like that term, because there's no such thing as post-scarcity. There will always be scarcity, in a finite amount of resources. In a sense, it just as a law of physics of the universe and the nature of human reality, there will always be limits to what we can do, and there will always be scarce resources. But post-scarcity, we are coming to the point of a post-scarcity society or economy, at least in terms of immediate human needs, for food, for clothing, for housing. We can 3D print houses already. All of those things are becoming so cheap and so readily available that, in another, I always, I'm very careful about putting numbers on these things, but maybe 20 to 30 years, we're going to see a whole different world, because people are not going to be driven to violence by individual need. No one is going to, obviously we're going to see the end of the drug war. Nobody's going to have to steal money to buy drugs. Heck, you'll be able to 3D print your own drugs at some point. And, nobody's going to be stealing for food. The idea of fighting over, creature comforts and whatever you need for your personal health and wealth and well-being is just going to be absurd. It's going to be an historical anachronism that we can see with technology. We are actually evolving past.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a bright future.
Humanity marches on.
Yeah.
I just wanted to hook in a little bit because here in the Netherlands, a while back, they farmed a hamburger. They printed it with 40 billion cells.
Yep.
So you can already see that the first steps are being taken, and within 2 decades, I think it's possible that everybody can have a 3D printer for himself, having the templates, having everything online. If you can see how easy it is to have a website now with all the templates that are already available, I think it's a matter of time before the infrastructure is there for us to use.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. Are there some things that you want to add to the whole conversation that we had the last hour?
Well, you know me, I really, all I care about now is getting people to read the book, Freedom.
Yeah.
And I hope that you guys get it translated for people but I guess if they're understanding me right now, they can read the book. It's
most Dutch people understand English.
Right. So I hope people will read it and share it and use it as a tool, because that's what we wrote it to be, is to be a tool to grow the movement. And I hope people consider what they do in their activism. Once they've embraced this message, what's the most effective way to share it with people, to make the world a better place, to move humanity forward. And, I don't want to say that the book is the be-all, end-all, but so far no one has told me that there's something they would rather hand someone to wake them up or to get them thinking about freedom. So I hope people will share it, and take it as a tool, use it as a way to grow the movement. It's in small sections. It's very short. It's 100 pages. It's a 3-hour audiobook available for free in every digital format possible. It's not Amerocentric. It's not judgmental. There's no opinions or exaggerations or anything like that. And it's a very easy way to share the message and wake someone up. And if you don't, you know what? If this isn't it, if you don't think that this is the best thing, then I would just challenge you to come up with something else. But if you can't, and if you want to take my book and rewrite it, if you think like, hey, getting it out to your audience or to people in the Netherlands, it's got to have this section, or this section doesn't help, or whatever. You know what? Do it. Rewrite it. Take it. But let's grow the movement, because that's what's actually going to move humanity forward. And if people want to help me out, right now we're raising money for the tour that I'm going on this next year to hand the book out to as many people as possible. And the link is on our website, thefreedomline.com, but you can also go directly to Indiegogo and look for the American Campfire Freedom Tour.
Yeah. You started the book with today is an amazing time to be alive, and then the book starts, and I think after what you just told and what I read in the book, it's that's the feeling that you get when you read the book, eh?
Absolutely.
You start to realize, hey, we live in an exciting time. And I want to thank you. I hope, is there also a second book coming, or a third?
Well, actually, I've already written another book which is a war memoir called Hot, Dirty, and Dangerous. But we're going to be waiting to release that until we get a few more books out in the Freedom series. And as you know, a lot of people can read a 100-page book and still have questions. And we answered as many "but what about" type questions because people go, "But what about this? But what about that?" We answered as many as possible in this book, but a lot of people need more. So like there's a chapter on economics. I'm going to write a book on that. We're going to write a book on activism, on achieving freedom. We're going to write a book on health freedom, which is also a short section in chapter 9. So there's actually 20 books in the series that we're calling the Encyclopedia of Freedom. And when the tour is over, I hope to settle down and write the rest of the series and focus on my career as an author.
Is there also a movie coming? Because I heard you had a little role in the new movie, The Prey. It was, I think.
Oh no, unfortunately I wasn't able to finish that because I was in jail.
Okay.
But, in some ways I'm kind of glad. There are other projects. There's a lot of stuff going on. But really, for me, it's all about the book right now. It's all about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Adam.
My pleasure.
Yeah, me too. And Steph?
Well, yeah, thank you. It was nice to talking with you, and have a nice time in America.
Yeah.
Thanks, appreciate it, gents.